Hey, in these lectures, we're going to be talking about evolution, the history of theories about evolution, and we're going to talk about other evolutionary mechanisms. But I want to start out, first of all, by talking about this idea that species change. That's what evolution is. Evolution, our technical term that we use today, is a change in allele frequencies over time, which will make more sense later. But really, it just means that species change over time. And long before Darwin, people had figured out that there were things on Earth that had been there before that weren't there anymore. And in Europe, at least, people called this natural history, the study of the history of the natural world. And they, people had found fossils of things that sort of looked like a fish but had teeth that we don't see in fish, and, things that are sort of like birds but kind of like lizards, and whatever the heck this is. Okay, it's a trilobite. That didn't exist anymore. And so people knew that there were things that had been on Earth that weren't there anymore. And a lot of natural historians had been trying to figure out how things changed on Earth. There were a number of famous thinkers who thought about and wrote about Darwin. One of those was Charles Darwin's grandfather. His name was Erasmus Darwin. And he thought something that was really common at the time, and actually a lot of people still sort of think that evolution works this way, that species improve themselves over time. And of course, that culminates in humanity, which is, of course, the most perfect thing on the planet, which is not true at all. But anyway, that's what people thought. And in 1794, he wrote this book, Zoonomia, spelling out his ideas about it. He is not well known for that. He was, in fact, completely wrong. But he is more well known for his erotic poetry about plants. And I will let you Google his name and learn more about that. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was another famous thinker who wrote his Philosophie zoologique in 1809. And he thought that organisms passed traits to their offspring that they had developed during their lifetime. So, for example, that the giraffe has a long neck because it stretched its neck during its life to reach food on higher branches, and then that long neck passed to its offspring. Now, he could have talked to any farmer or anyone who's ever bred pigeons or dogs or anything, and found out that that was not how anything works. But he chose not to. His thinking stuck around for a very long time. So that's just two examples. So Charles Darwin grows up. He grows up in a fairly wealthy family in England, up here, and long before he signed on to join the Beagle in its crew, or not its crew, as accompaniment to the captain. He grew up in a family where his father was a doctor, and his father wanted him to be a doctor. And he didn't want to be a doctor. He really just liked collecting beetles and, looking at nature, and he didn't want to go into medicine. But his father sent him to medical school anyway. He failed out. He just sort of stopped going to classes. His brother became a doctor. And then Charles, his father said, okay, well then the other option you have as a younger son in the landed gentry class is to be a parson or a minister. And so his father sent him to divinity school at Cambridge University. And at Cambridge, Darwin met a bunch of other natural scientists and said, I guess I could be a parson part-time and spend my spare time as a natural scientist, which was actually something that a lot of people did. And after he graduated, he found out about this voyage that was supposed to travel around the world for 3 years, surveying coastlines and making maps to improve British shipping. And the captain had already done one of these journeys and decided that it would be really helpful to have a scientist along, or at least someone who could catalog all of these amazing things that they saw, and that he would like to have someone to talk to. The captain of a ship in those days was not supposed to talk to, definitely not the crew, and he wasn't really supposed to be particularly social with the other officers. So captains tended to be very, very lonely. So he met this young man, Charles Darwin, and Charles Darwin said, sure, I'll pack up for 3 years and travel around the world and look at stuff. That sounds way better than being a parson. So he signed on. The journey actually ended up being 5 years. And what Darwin didn't realize when he signed up for it was that he got terrible seasickness. And every time the ship was at sea, he was sick. Always. So they sailed out from England. They sailed down across the Atlantic, down the coast of South America, back and forth to survey some coastlines around South America, out to the Galapagos Islands, where they spent about 5 weeks. And there, Darwin gathered many, many specimens of the birds that existed in the Galapagos, and those would become the sort of seed, to use a weird word, of his research into the changing of species and what would become his theory of natural selection. The Beagle then sailed across the Pacific to New Zealand and Australia, across the Indian Ocean, and then along Africa, back to South America, back down South America, and then back up to England. So 5 years, he did in fact go all the way around the world. And while they were traveling, he was writing letters to his friends. He was writing letters to scientific societies. He was sending back on other ships that they met that were returning to England. He was sending back specimens that he had collected. So by the time he got back, he was actually quite famous. And he didn't have to go be a parson because he was famous enough and rich enough that and with his family's money, he could live just fine being a scientist. So here are some of the things that he saw that shaped his thinking. One thing is that he saw animals on other continents that didn't look anything like anything he had ever seen in Europe or anything that lived in Europe. This is a tapir. They live in South America and in Asia. This is a baby tapir, which you have to admit is the cutest baby on the planet. They're really adorable. It's not a pig. It's not an elephant. It's something else. But there's nothing like that in Europe. This is a capybara that is the largest rodent in the world. Kind of looks like a guinea pig that's gotten overgrown. They can grow up to be 100 pounds, and they're really good swimmers. This is a wakiri. It's a monkey with this bright red face. There are no monkeys in Europe, and he saw lots and lots of monkeys in South America and birds like this toucan. And so he started wondering, why is it that there are creatures in one place that are not in another place? And the answer at the time that the church, that religion had provided, the Christian church had provided, was that God put them there, and that's all there was to it. God put some things in one place and some things in another place, which is a perfectly fine explanation, except it's not a scientific one, and it can't be tested. And Darwin wanted something more. He thought maybe there was something else to it. He also found that there were animals on the islands, especially the Galapagos Islands. There were a lot of animals that looked a lot like animals on the mainland. So, for example, here's a land iguana, and here's a marine iguana that lives on the Galapagos Islands. This one is actually feeds on algae. It swims in the water. I know it looks like a cute little Godzilla, but it's fearsome looking, but it's totally peaceful. Lives on algae. This one also pretty peaceful. Usually climbs in trees and eats insects. But they look kind of similar. They've both got this fringe down the back. And Darwin thought, well, what if organisms on the island what if they started out on the mainland and then floated or were blown by a storm or I don't know, something, managed to get to the island, and then they changed once they got to the island based on what food was available and what environment was available for them there. He also saw that animals on different islands looked different from each other. So some of the Galapagos Islands are very wet, and there are these giant tortoises that live on all the Galapagos, sorry, not all of them, some of the Galapagos Islands. And the shape of their shell depends on the environment they live in. So in the islands where there's a lot of water, where it rains a lot, the turtles tend to have these domed shells, tortoises. All tortoises are actually turtles, but turtles live in the water and tortoises live on land. I apologize, I should have said tortoise. And on drier places, they tend to have flatter shells. So this one acts kind of like an umbrella. You know, the water just drains off, whereas this one could actually collect water for the tortoise. So once he got back home, he had all of these specimens and he had all of these thoughts about how this thing could work. And he thought, well, I need to study some more. And so he started off, one of the things he studied, not the first thing, but one of the things he studied was artificial selection, which is animal breeding. It's just a fancy term for animal breeding. So artificial selection means literally humans choosing which traits to select for and breed animals or plants to get more of those traits. So, you know, one of the ways that humans have done this is with dogs. So all dogs, of course, are related to wolves. And all dog breeds are actually the same species. They can all interbreed, and yes, you can breed a Chihuahua with a Great Dane. There's some logistical problems, I would imagine, but it can be done. And Darwin thought, well, if humans could make this much difference in an animal in, you know, hundreds of years, then Mother Nature must be able to do more. And at this point, scientists hadn't really figured out how old the Earth was. The church was saying that the Earth was probably about 6,000 years old. Scientists had figured out that it was probably several million years old, maybe 100 million. It turns out it's 4 billion years old. They were off by quite a ways, but they didn't know that yet. But if you think about how nature having 4 billion years, then there's plenty of time for small changes to turn into big changes over time. Another thing that Darwin studied was pigeon breeding. So these are, you know, your basic pigeons. And still today, there are people who breed fancy pigeons and exhibit them and show them. And depending on what characteristics you breed for, you can get some really interesting looking pigeons, like giant tail feathers or giant leg feathers or these curly feathers around the neck or on the body. And so again, if humans can make these kinds of changes over, you know, tens of generations or hundreds of generations, well, then how much more can nature do with much more time? So Darwin came up with this idea that these small incremental changes over time could add up to very large changes in organisms. And that instead of humans choosing what traits would get passed on, nature chooses by eliminating some individuals from the breeding pool. So organisms as a species, not as an individual. As an individual, your DNA does not change over your lifetime. But the human species does evolve, as does every other species on Earth. And they adapt to their environments. What does that mean, adapt? Now, we think of adaptation as in I'm adapting to, you know, the classroom environment that I'm in this semester, which is, you know, a thing we always do, right? Okay, well, this teacher doesn't like that, so I'm going to adapt to this teacher's teaching style. This is a different use of that word adapt. This is Darwin didn't know it at the time. We hadn't discovered genes yet. But this is a change in the actual genes of a species, a change in the gene pool as a whole. So given that nature has innumerable generations, hundreds, thousands, millions of generations to shape a species, and the environment is constantly changing. And this is an important thing because although we think of the environment as being, mostly the same, in fact, environments are changing all the time. They're drier, they're wetter. Animals, organisms move from one environment to another and then have to adapt to that new environment. And then over geologic time, over the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, the environment changes a great deal, which is why we see fossils of sea creatures in places that are today mountains, because hundreds of millions of years ago, those places were at the bottom of an ocean, because environments over geologic time change a great deal, and species have been changing over that period of time. So if humans can select based on human desired traits, then nature can also select based on the traits that are best suited to any given environment. And that is the key to natural selection. Nature selects, although there's not like there's any hand of nature that's actually, choosing this one or that one. It's just a matter of the organisms with the traits best suited to the current environment are going to be able to survive and pass on their genes. And that's what's important. All right, in the next section, I'm going to come back and talk a little more about Darwin and his journey through becoming a more respected scientist, and then writing his piece on the origin of species. And then we'll talk about more evidence for evolution and then other mechanisms that create evolution.